Okay. There we go. And Kira, I've been having this like weird thing. This actually is relevant for both. I've been having this weird computer thing where my laptop will go to sleep like it does when you're inactive, and I just have to like wake it back up again. But it happens during Zoom meetings sometimes.
Oh
So if
yeah.
I freeze, it's like I can still hear you guys, but I'm trying to get back on.
Yeah, there's been some Zoom updates that are kind of weird, I think. I had one where now it doesn't connect to any speakers other than my
That's
even Bluetooth headphones. Like I have to plug in them.
you would think
Yeah.
after all of this, after
Yeah.
how many years we've been doing things on Zoom, that we would be
Yeah.
past. But say la vie. Okay. So there should be my screen for you guys. And yeah, so welcome. So this is the first of our 3-part workshop series on getting to know the North Clackamas Watersheds. I'm Alexis. I do outreach and education work for the North Clackamas Watersheds Council. And first, we kind of start off with a thanks to our funders and partners. So these workshop series are funded by Oak Lodge Water Services and Clackamas Water Environment Services and the Clackamas County Soil and Water Conservation District. And Oak Lodge Water Services and West Water Environment Services each cover sort of different parts of the North Clackamas watersheds. So Linda, I believe that you would be covered by Oak Lodge Water Services being along River Forest Creek, whereas folks
Yes,
whereas like folks in
I'm
Noah
definitely part of Oak Lodge Water Services.
yeah, perfect. Yeah, so we work with the folks there, and they're great and they support our work. And I live in Happy Valley, so if I was in the Happy Valley portion of the North Clackamas watersheds, Wes is my water service provider. So different geographies. And then the Clackamas County Soil and Water Conservation District are fantastic partners. They cover all of Clackamas County. So a lot of folks are familiar with watershed councils as nonprofits, and watershed councils as a type of entity across the state work often closely with soil and water conservation districts, which are another kind of entity that just covers certain geographic areas and provides resources to support basically soil and water conservation. And so soil and water conservation districts are not only in Oregon, but all across all of the United States and US territories like Puerto Rico and Guam.
Okay.
And so soil and water conservation districts also some of them have tax bases, so they have a lot more capacity and staff to implement and support kind of landowners across their districts. More so than watershed councils. We're more of the small nonprofit side of things. So yeah, all of these folks are good partners to us. And for housekeeping, the kind of things that I say that are obviously more relevant when we have bigger groups is to generally keep your microphones muted, but know that there's going to be some times that I might, call on you all for interactivity. I have a background in environmental education, and so I always joke with folks at the start of presentations, like I might give you the 3rd grader treatment, but it's a compliment because we're all learners all of our lives. So I might do a bit of a call and response, especially tomorrow on the wildlife workshop. We've already done introductions, and then of course, any questions that come up, please feel free to come off of mute and interrupt me. As I've said, like I really like the conversational aspect of these workshops, but you can also put questions in chat, of course. One of the things that the council is hoping to do through these workshops, and increasingly, Kira, spoiler alert moving forward, is to find ways to develop an ongoing connection with attendees in these workshops. And so as we kind of move through tonight, there will be some times when, and especially as we wrap up, like I'll ask, what are some ways that you want to get more involved in watershed council work or in watershed work, and how can we support you in those things? So Linda, for instance, I already know that talking about plants along your stretch of the creek is going to be that thing for you for this ongoing engagement piece. And we want everyone to know that we're available afterwards to help continue providing resources for folks. I will try and save some time for Q&A and discussion at the end. This is that action piece that I was discussing. And then a thank you to one of our board members named Steve Berliner. He is a awesome photographer. And so especially again tomorrow during the wildlife, we'll get to see a lot of Steve's photos, but many of the photos in the presentation today are from Steve. So we're gonna just starting off with looking at some of the different sites around the watershed. This is a photo of Mount Talbert, which is a Metro-owned property. And in our urban and suburban spaces, right, natural areas are really important. And this is a good example of one that folks have access to. This right here is the confluence of Rynearson Creek with the Willamette River. And here there was a really neat salmon habitat restoration project a few years ago. I see that we have one more person joining us. Awesome. Welcome, Steve. I'm gonna see if I can hang on just long enough to hear from you since we barely got started. Hi, Steve, can you hear us? I'm not sure if you can hear us, Steve, but welcome. We just did a quick round of introductions, and as you can probably see, we have a good small group. Hi, I see you're off mute.
I'm not sure. I guess I'm technically challenged. I don't see the mute button.
Oh, we came off of mute, so I think you found the right thing.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, we sure
Okay,
can.
fine. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it looks like a little microphone, and sometimes it looks like you're on your phone. So on the Zoom app, sometimes you have to like tap the screen to unmute, and you can swipe things back and forth.
Okay.
I find the Zoom app a little confusing, but yeah, welcome. Do you live in the North Clackamas Watersheds?
I
I think your audio just cut out just a
near
little.
Kellogg Creek.
Kellogg Creek? Oh, that's right. I read
Near
that on your
Kellogg Creek. Can you hear me?
registration.
Sorry.
That's the tricky thing with Zoom is everyone pauses and then starts talking at the exact same time. So no worries. Yeah, so Steve, we only really just got started. I thanked our sponsors and funders, and we kind of did a brief introductions. We have a small group tonight, which I love because it gives us a chance to be more interactive. So the main things for you to know to catch right up are just that this can be a really interactive conversation. So if you have any questions, please, yeah, speak up, or, you can put it in the chat if that's easier. But hopefully you can see the shared screen okay. And yeah, we were just getting started. Okay, so this is again the confluence of Rynearson Creek with the Willamette River. And we just wanted to show these photos to start us off, Mount Talbert here and then Rynearson, because we're kind of in a pretty urbanized area, right? Like we are in the towns of Milwaukee or Gladstone or Happy Valley, and unincorporated Clackamas County like Oak Grove and Jennings Lodge. And so it's sometimes we forget that these big natural areas are around us and they can be really important. So we also hope that you get out and are able to explore places throughout the watersheds. This is an example of folks observing maybe some white-breasted nuthatches at North Clackamas Park. And really these two side by side are just in these urban areas, we do have healthy salmon populations, kind of in spite of and despite the fact that there's urbanization, right? So I think that oftentimes we just like societally or in conversation kind of oversimplify things and make them black and white, like, things are bad, things are good. And here in urban areas, it's just a lot of there's a lot of value, I think, in having a bit of nuance about the types of habitat that urban areas are able to provide for wildlife, especially endangered wildlife like salmon. So thanks for joining us today. And what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to mostly be talking about what are watersheds and the North Clackamas watersheds in particular. And then we'll dig into what are the different things that influence our watersheds' health. And then we're going to go through sort of a 3-chapter session about what can we do to support our watershed. So I'll talk about the things that we can do as individuals, the things that we do sort of in community partnership with one another, like the Watersheds Council work. And then the things that happen at a bigger scale, maybe like with government level collaboration. So we're going to talk about all the different ways that we can support watershed health. And as you all know, this is part of a series. So tomorrow night we'll be digging into wildlife in the North Clackamas Watersheds. And then on Wednesday night, we'll talk about people and place and kind of dig into some environmental justice issues. And I really love this workshop series. It's really fun. So I'm excited. And, you know, we might have, for instance, more folks join us tonight or Wednesday than there are today. And you guys aren't obligated to come tomorrow and Wednesday either. You can, it's one or two or all three are what folks can attend. So we want to kind of start off with a little bit of a tale of two buildings. So to steal a line from Charles Dickens, who's talking at a full scale of two cities, we could look just, for instance, at two buildings here. So what we know in the North Clackamas Watersheds is that our population is increasing. More people are moving to the area and are being born here, and especially towards the edges of the watersheds, there's lots of growth happening, right? So we will be building more buildings for housing and for everything else. And this is just to show that we can build our sort of typical or standard expected building, you know, with a cement roof and cement parking lot. Or we can think a little bit more innovatively and differently and build buildings that look like this on the right-hand side here, that are, you know, the same size, same footprint, but can be much more friendly in regards to watershed health. So there's a bunch of different examples on this photo on the right of ways that this option is better for our creeks. So, you know, what might happen in the stream behind our houses can really start further away. And that's one of the biggest things about watersheds that the council, you know, strives to communicate through these workshops. So as we, you know, as a community have more choices, because we know growth is inevitable, we can choose between a creek friendly building or not, right? The one on the left might be cheaper up front, but could be more expensive in the long run. So that's kind of what we'll be digging into, is how we can make good choices both individually and collectively. So what is a watershed? And this is something that I talk about often. A watershed is watershed is a word that is in a way used so frequently that we sometimes forget what it exactly means, right? And so all a watershed is a geographic area where all of the water that falls drains to a common place or a common body of water. So for instance, if we have a lake, all of the area around the lake where the water drains into the lake, that is that lake's watershed. The watershed boundaries are often on ridge tops, because you can look, you know, on one side of the mountain, it flows down into this river, and on this other side of the mountain, it flows into a separate stream system. I love talking about watersheds because no matter where you are, you're in a watershed. Even in the middle of the desert, water moves somewhere. And so what that does is that makes what we do immediately relevant, right? So this diagram showing what looks to be a pretty large watershed is showing different types of land uses that can happen in all of these things, because no matter where you are, you're in a watershed. These things all matter. And so what happens throughout the watershed matters. And another way to say that is, you know, we tend to focus on the creek itself or the animals in the creek, but the upstream land areas will affect the creek health too. And watersheds are sort of like the little Russian nesting dolls, where one fits inside of the other, which fits inside of the other. It's a matter of scale. So we could say that this divide, this big watershed that's taking up most of the photo here, we could say, for instance, that is the Columbia River watershed, because it looks like it meets the ocean. The Columbia River watershed is huge. It's like the size of France. It goes all the way up into Canada, and I think like Montana and Utah. It's really, really large. The Willamette River is one of the main tributaries to the Columbia River. So we could go from looking all the way at the Columbia River Basin watershed and focus into the Willamette River watershed. And the Willamette River Basin watershed takes up a big chunk of the state of Oregon. And so we could say that maybe this river right here is the Willamette. And then we can zoom in even further and say, well, let's look at Kellogg and Mount Scott Creek system. That's a tributary to the Willamette River. And we could zoom in even more and look at one of the smaller tributaries to Kellogg Creek. So each of those bodies of water, which feeds into a larger body of water, those tributaries each have their own watershed. So we could focus in on river forest, on the Willamette, on the Columbia. It's just a matter of scale. And different organizations work at different sizes of scale. So this photo right here, it briefly showed the Portland metro area, and then I put on a layer demonstrating various watersheds in town. And right here is the North Clackamas Watershed. So we're going to zoom in to the North Clackamas Watersheds, which is now this green area that's shown. So the North Clackamas Watersheds, you'll notice I'm using watersheds plural, and that's because the North Clackamas Watersheds Council focuses on several different sort of sub watersheds to the Willamette River. So our work boundaries are basically the Willamette River in the west, the Willamette River in the west all the way up to Happy Valley on the east side, and then down towards Gladstone and kind of border to Milwaukee at the top. So you'll see the Willamette River on the left-hand side here, and then on the south side, you see the Clackamas River here. So none of the North Clackamas Watersheds Council's watersheds flow directly into the Clackamas River. They all flow into the Willamette, but we're North Clackamas County. So we have together several different watersheds. So this slide is showing now where the surface streams are in the North Clackamas watershed. So again, just from looking on a map, there might be more here than you would expect. And you also are probably noticing that there's some segments, right? And we know that creeks don't just stop and start again. Like that's not how our waterways flow or function. So again, this is showing just surface streams with a 100-meter buffer. So the creeks aren't as wide as this whole purple swath shows. This purple swath is about the width of the Willamette River in places. So that's just the purple buffer is to make it a little bit easier to see. And when we say that these streams here are surface streams, they're segmented because a lot of creeks in urban areas have been piped. So the next slide is going to show the same thing plus the piped sections of the streams. So here you can see now in blue that there's a lot of places where we have the creeks moving kind of below ground. And then we're going to add on some arrows, and these arrows are just showing the direction of water flow. So the largest system is, I'm going to move to the next slide here to show those arrows again. We have the Kellogg and the Mount Scott watershed. So that's this pink and green section right here. So Mount Scott Creek is a tributary into Kellogg Creek. So we call this, the pink and the green together, the Kellogg Mount Scott watersheds. And then we have River Forest Creek and Boardman Creek and Rainierson Creek. The brown edges on the top here where my cursor is at Milwaukee, and then on the east side at Happy Valley and on the south side at Gladstone, those are city boundaries. So beyond where it's just white instead of brown is unincorporated Clackamas County. Now, obviously, as you can see, right, our creeks move across those different jurisdictions. Salmon don't know what county they're in when they're, migrating. A coyote doesn't know that they've moved into a different municipality when they, cross a street or something like that. So, so again, this is kind of a grounding in that what watershed councils work on is the entire watershed is significant because it's all part of this habitat. So everything that happens throughout these colored areas is going to affect the habitat that the North Clackamas watersheds can provide. So the Mount Scott watershed starts kind of near Scouters Mountain and moves down through the Three Creeks natural area, which is near the Clackamas Aquatic Center. It merges with Kellogg Creek, and then Kellogg Creek, which is started kind of up towards Johnson City. Together, those then reach the Kellogg Dam impoundment, or what a lot of people call Kellogg Lake. And that's the lake is not a natural lake; it's an impoundment behind Kellogg Dam, which we'll talk more a little bit about later. But that's about where, just downstream of Kellogg Dam is where Kellogg Creek meets the Willamette River. Now, River Forest and Boardman, Rainierson Creeks all drain off of the Oakfield Ridge and go straight into the Willamette. Okay. Any questions about like the watersheds, knowing that we'll talk a little bit about them more? And that's okay if not. One of my college professors told us on the first day, I'm going to wait 30 seconds after I ask a question, and it's going to be an awkward silence, but it's giving you time to think. So I'm not going to give us a full 30 seconds, but know that you have as much time to pipe up as you want. Okay, so what did these watersheds look like then before cities? What were these watersheds like? They were really seasonally flooded wetlands and floodplain areas. So a lot of the flat places in the Portland metro area were historically oak savanna habitat and were sort of first built on for things like farming and development. And so a lot of the time folks think of the trees in the Portland area, we think of our evergreen, our Douglas fir, and our western red cedars. And that tends to be because in the flatter areas where we had oak savanna, that's what got built first. We had beavers that were actively, creating abundant habitat, supporting fish like salmon and steelhead and trout. And these watersheds were really actively stewarded by Indigenous folks here, not passively lived on. And that's something that you'll hear folks in the environmental field discussing more than we were maybe 15 years ago, that these places were really actively managed and still are actively managed in places by Indigenous community members. And so the Clackamas and the Cowlitz and the Tualatin Kalapuya and the Molalla are some of the Indigenous groups in this area. And increasingly, like Western science practitioners such as myself are collaborating more and incorporating Indigenous ecological knowledge into watershed and land management. And there's a lot of really valuable learnings and really awesome collaboration that happens there. And so like an example that I give, for instance, regarding these places being actively stewarded is just simply the use of fire. That fire has been an active part of the landscape, and only in the last couple of 100 years where we have suppressed fire and been afraid to allow our forests, to burn, we've seen this increase buildup of ladder fuels, and we have now more severe and catastrophic wildfires than we did when wildfire was an active part of the regime of management by Indigenous community members. So this is a chance where I'm gonna invite you to speak up and say, what are the things that you see here? What does this healthy stream, what do you notice about this healthy stream system? There's no wrong answers.
A lot of logs in the middle of the water.
Absolutely, yeah.
A lot of moss growth and plant growth right down to the edge of the water.
Yeah, the greenery reaching all the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Steve or Kira, anything else? Oh, Kira, I think you talked about you're muted.
I was gonna say, I see some, salmon. Yeah, I see some salmon and, maybe that's a trail. I was gonna say a trail, but I actually might be wrong there. I'm at least projecting a trail down on the right-hand side there.
Oh yeah, or that one right there. Yeah. So there's a lot of good habitat things happening in this photo. And one of those, Linda, like you said, is all of the wood in the stream. In the last couple of 100 years, there was a concerted effort to remove logs from our creeks, in order to make, like barge transportation of products like timber, easier. And so that's been a net negative as far as salmon habitat goes, to remove this log. It's an absolutely natural part of the landscape, and wood in streams adds a lot of what's called habitat complexity. So you can see just in this photo, like there's places where the fish are able to hide in amongst the root wads, and I've seen birds of prey that are regularly hunting those fish, and they stand on those wood logs. So having downed woody debris in our streams is a really healthy thing as well. Beaver aren't shown here directly, and I know we'll talk about beaver tomorrow, so I won't spend too much time here. And this is what our watersheds look like now, right? We've built a lot of stuff, and so what do we have on balance, right? This isn't what every single part of our watersheds look like, of course. So today we have, in the North Clackamas watersheds, we have we have mixed uses. So these photos kind of show what part of the watershed they're representing, but we have places where the floodplains, or other parts of the watershed are less developed. So this is the Three Creeks natural area. We have more, suburban areas where we've had a lot of early development. So this is the McLaughlin Boulevard corridor. So McLaughlin, or 99 East, crosses all of the creeks in the North Clackamas watersheds. And a lot of our streets and industrial or earlier built areas were built before we really knew how to adequately preserve habitat for fish. And then we have a lot of just suburban neighborhoods, where we have houses and the creeks kind of running through behind our houses. So if our watersheds, if we were to instead draw a jurisdictional line around the North Clackamas watersheds, our city or our town would be about the size of Eugene. So we have 165,000 people living in the North Clackamas watersheds. So all of this leads to a lot of impacts of urbanization. And these are some of the things we'll be spending our time talking about tonight. We have a lot of pavement, for instance. We have built buildings in floodplain areas. We've altered the hydrology, and so we're experiencing things like flooding and fragmented habitat, and creeks that are often too warm and or polluted. And we also have fewer natural areas. And that's kind of why the North Clackamas Watersheds Council, or NCWIC, why we exist, right? A lot of watershed councils generally were formed after salmon were listed on the Endangered Species Act, right? When community groups started to realize, hey, we're hearing all these concerns about salmon populations, and we know that this creek in our neighborhood isn't as healthy as it was or could or should be. So yeah, dealing with all of these impacts of urbanization as a nonprofit is why we are here. Okay, the 1970s TV reference gets credited to Neil, our executive director. He's the first to say he's always coming through with the bad jokes. But what do you guys see happening in this photo on the right-hand side? So this is another interactive one. We kind of called out the good things in the photo a couple slides back. What are the things that we see happening here?
Looks like erosion on the right-hand side.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see that kind of steep drop in of the bank. Anything else that you guys want to call out? I see some of us peering a bit closer.
Is there, looks like cultivated grass on the right,
Exactly. Yeah, right. This
fertilizing their lawn.
yeah, just a lawn leading all the way up to the bed of the creek. There is, a mature tree here, but what we have when we have only lawn is we have a loss of, or a lack of shade. A lack of tree roots to hold the soil on the banks together. And yeah, with erosion, like you can actually see some of the tree roots sticking out here and the soil falling into the creek. Some other things that we could look at here are that the water level is kind of low. So judging by the fallen leaves, this photo is taken in fall, which is, you know, the end of summer is typically when flows are the lowest. Which is also then therefore when water temperatures can get warmer, which is a not good thing. When we have shallower water, it heats up more quickly when we have, for instance, a lack of shade. And any really savvy plant people on big screens might notice that there's some invasive plant vegetation on the left-hand side here. I will say it looks like the substrate on this section of the creek here is gravel, which is good for fish, for their eggs to be laid in.
Are
Sometimes,
those blackberries on the on the left-hand side?
yeah, it looks like blackberry. And what I wouldn't be surprised is if this is ivy or not, but I can't tell for sure. But
yeah,
that
totally
is
could
more
be.
recognizably the blackberry that calls out to me too.
Yep.
Yeah, and so another thing that's good is we have some curves on the stretch of the creek, so some sinuosity is generally good. It adds that habitat complexity that we were discussing earlier. So when we have downed trees in the creek, they make the water move a bit differently instead of the water moving through really straight and fast. Having those curves is a good thing for watersheds and for creek health. So what might this lead to? It might lead to something that looks like this. Now, this is not from the North Clackamas Watersheds, but not very far from us either. This is our creek neighbor to the north. This is Johnson Creek at flood stage. And what we see here is right here, there's this wall, there's a physical barrier that is disconnecting Johnson Creek from its floodplain. So when water has nowhere to spill out to, it's going to flow through with more force. And so when it rains really hard, we see things like this where a creek is really, really raging. Back in, I want to say it was like early mid-December when we had those really heavy rains come through, right? We experienced flooding more. And again, like historically, these whole areas were seasonal wetlands, have been floodplains. And in a lot of urbanization, we've disconnected our creeks from our floodplains. And so reconnecting creeks to floodplains, letting our creek be a creek is a really positive thing that we can do that is going to have benefits kind of throughout the watershed for neighbors throughout. Yeah, so we have some pretty cumulative impacts from urbanization. This photo is demonstrating what a floodplain looks like kind of at a cross section. So a floodplain is really just the highest that the water gets and when water spills over its banks. And sometimes, for instance, in that previous photo of Johnson Creek, that can be a really abrupt and harsh and sudden change. Or when our creeks have access to the floodplains, the water levels can move in and out of the floodplains with a bit more gentleness. So a floodplain is just the low-lying ground that's adjacent to our creeks and rivers, which are subject to flooding. And floodplains are incredibly important. Socioeconomically, they're really valuable for agriculture and tourism and recreation as well. As far as water goes, floodplains store water, so that reduces the velocity of the streams and the intensity of flooding peaks. It also recharges our groundwater. In that photo of the bank with the erosion happening that was during late fall, just 2 slides ago, our water levels, we deal with low water issues, but when our creeks have access to the floodplain and water can soak in more, that allows for more late season water availability. So our floodplains help to just, recharge, hold on to, and then slowly release water They also provide a chance for sediment to settle. And we don't want too much suspended sediment in our creek systems. And they'll filter for things like pollutants and nutrients as well. Floodplains are also, as far as habitat goes, really valuable rearing habitat for young salmon. Like one thing I skipped over is floodplains can help mitigate temperature fluctuations as well. So providing our creek access to floodplains is really one of the bigger issues and bigger significant way to improve the habitat that we have. So this is particularly relevant, I would say, in the Kellogg Mount Scott subwatershed, because there's still development happening in the upper Mount Scott watershed, but throughout all of the North Clackamas watersheds and watersheds in urban areas. It's worth kind of thinking about how today's floodplain isn't necessarily tomorrow's floodplain, right? So in this photo, we can see that right here, kind of where my cursor is towards the right, is where our river might ordinarily be flowing. And when we have storms, it can kind of move above its banks and into the floodplain areas, right? There's plenty of trees that are have evolved to being, submerged underwater. Their trunks and roots submerged underwater for parts of the year. But right here, where we have nothing else in the floodplain, you can see that this factory over here and these houses on the right-hand side, that they're protected, right? The floodplain, the creek, when the creek gets, when we have a lot of rain and the creek gets swollen, it flows into the floodplain. Now on the next slide, it's going to show what happens when we build in our floodplains. So when we put in buildings in our floodplains, which is something that has broadly happened across urban areas. So what we have now is we have less floodplain for that water to move into. So that doesn't only mean I remembered that one of the things I used to say here is they paid to put in a parking lot. If you know that song, they paved paradise and put in a parking lot, right? What we've seen here now is the flood level has actually increased. And so that means that the houses and the factories that were previously fine are now susceptible to flooding. So if you prevent floodplain fill, you kind of keep existing development safe. And I'll toggle back and forth between those two photos just so you can kind of get a sense for that comparison. But yeah, really, it's just that the buildings that used to be outside of the floodplain are now more vulnerable when we build in them. So the part of the reason why this is just the difference between pervious and impervious surfaces. So pervious surfaces or porous surfaces are places that can absorb water. So for instance, forested areas and natural areas, or things like green roofs. What happens when we have pervious surfaces is that water will soak, it'll hit trees and it'll also soak into the ground more. And so what we have is we have less surface runoff and more subsurface flow, because we're providing a space for that water to soak in underground and then release more slowly. And then when we have impervious surfaces, so when we've done things like, when we've built things like roads and parking lots and roofs, there's less absorption capacity. And so we have more water that's moving across the surface. And it moves faster and it'll pick up pollutants and stuff as well. Plants, especially alongside creeks, are important because not only do they provide a spongy place for water to soak in, but those plants actually also filter the water so that it's cleaner. And this hydrograph shows stream flooding basically before and after urbanization in a watershed. And so what we see here, time is moving from left to right, and then the stream discharge, or the kind of water level, is what's shown and what's mapped here. So if this, on the first part of our day, is when we have a rainfall event in a forested watershed, the water, some of it's soaking in and then some of it's making its way downhill into the creeks, and then it kind of absorbs back in and moves downstream. When we have a watershed that has seen more impervious surfaces be added, what you have is right after a storm event, much more quickly. You have much more water reaching the stream. So it's you have a greater quantity of water that moves more rapidly into the stream, and is more likely again to carry pollutants as well. So this is kind of what this flashiness looks like in practice. So this is from across the river. This photo is in Tryon Creek. On the left side, we see what the creek looked like the same day as a rainstorm, and then the following day. Or maybe it was 2 days later. Maybe this was the day after the rainstorm and the day following. But what we have is this, it's called flashiness. Urban streams are known for being flashy. And urban streams are just known for having huge changes in water levels in just a few days following rainstorms. It's kind of hard to tell, but this is a photo of kind of right near our office during a flood back in 2015. Flooding is going to be exacerbated by upstream urbanization, and with climate change comes more severe weather patterns, which give us bigger storms, right? And we've just experienced that in terms of ice, but it's true for just straight up rain as well. And a lot of our urbanization happened before we really knew better. So 99E, as I mentioned, it crosses all of the creeks. It's a long, big swath of pavement, lots of parking lots. And this was built in 1932 when FDR was our president. So it was before, land planners were thinking about ecology and hydrology and all of these things we've just built. And therefore we have inherited a lot of what's called gray infrastructure. And how has that been handled in the past? We can take a look at our neighbors to the north again at Johnson Creek. So here's a photo of Johnson Creek in 1934. Again, remembering that this area used to be wetlands and floodplains in Oak Savannah. Portland's nickname Stumptown was given because when this place was being built, so many trees were cut down that you could hop from stump to stump. And that was the safer way to move around town because everything was so wet. And you can see the evidence of all of these stumps right alongside the banks of Johnson Creek. So even back in the 30s, Johnson Creek had a reputation for being a flood-prone stream system. So as part of the Works Progress administration, to get folks to work and to address flooding, they channelized the lower 14 miles of Johnson Creek. So they lined it with rock. So you can see they built this whole floor and sides of the creek for the water to move through. Any guesses if that helped or not?
Not.
You're right. Yep. It did not work. Their thinking at the time was if we channelize the stream, water can move through more quickly. And that's absolutely true. The water moves through really quickly because it's a straight chute. But that just makes way for more water to come in. And so now we have places, I think this is near Mill Road, where you have pavement right up to the banks of the creek. And so a lot of watershed council work is also working to undo well-intentioned but maybe not very knowledgeable efforts. And in the North Clackamas watersheds, we're a little bit lucky that we're outside of Portland, which got developed sooner, in that some of these lessons were learned before too much urbanization happened. So we're kind of on the cusp. We have some of that old gray infrastructure like McLaughlin 99E and the 82nd corridor as well, but we also have the benefit of increased watershed protections in some ways too.
So it was part of I understand that the dam in Milwaukee Bay Park is going to be, I don't know what they call it when a dam is decommissioned, but it's going to be taken out. Is that part of this effort to improve the watershed and help the plain? Could you talk a little bit about how dams affect it and removing it, how that will change it?
Yeah. So I'm gonna scroll ahead and see if I have a good slide. I have a slide later on about Kellogg Lake and Kellogg Dam, but yeah, so the plans in progress are to remove Kellogg Dam. And What has happened in the case of Kellogg is this dam hasn't served a purpose for a really long time, like within years after it was built. It was unused. There's a fish ladder that doesn't really work. And really the major implication is that there's this impoundment behind Kellogg Dam. So there's a bunch of sediment that has built up over time, and we have now basically an artificial lake.
So what was the original purpose of the dam?
It was for a flour mill, I think.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. And so what's happened is all of this water gets stuck up behind Kellogg Dam, and what we have is we have Kellogg Lake, which is pretty shallow. And so it heats up faster. And so even though Kellogg and Mount Scott have good cold water, once it reaches Kellogg Lake, that it's just a negative impact on the habitat quality to have warmer water. And that's actually also really relevant for River Forest Lake, because River Forest Creek, because as River Forest Creek moves downstream, then there's a it's called an inline pond, where it's in line with the creek instead of totally separate. There's an inline pond or lake called River Forest Lake, and that increases the temperature of River Forest Creek substantially at its downstream point. And that lake is right before where River Forest Creek meets the Willamette River.
So, but that's not because of a dam situation, is it?
It is not because of a dam situation, or if so, it's a much smaller kind of dam, but it is it's affecting the habitat of each of those creeks in a similar way by having a big, flat, shallow place for the water to get really warm.
Okay, so I hate to tell me if I'm taking you way too off course.
Nice.
But just learning about all this stuff is fascinating.
Yeah.
So how could that be helped? Like they're able to think about removing the dam at Kellogg to resolve that problem. How would this, and now I'm looking at the watershed map of Forest Creek watershed, how would that be fixed?
Yeah. So for River Forest, and this is a bit of a spoiler for what's to come, but because River Forest Lake is an amenity that those neighbors pay to have the view of the lake and stuff, I don't think that talks are, I don't know how receptive those neighbors are to the idea of removing the lake when it's a kind of key part of their neighborhood. So what the Watershed Council is pursuing a project just downstream of River Forest Lake to add some habitat complexity in the form of downed trees, downed logs, which is going to help provide habitat during already colder weather. So we're not expecting to be able to provide habitat for salmon during warmer times of the year, but we are wanting to improve the complexity of the habitat at that confluence during the times of year when the water is cold enough for them to be up in that tributary.
Cool. So it's just kind of okay, we let the lake be there and we improve the habitat between where the lake is and where it goes into the Willamette.
Exactly. And in both the case of Kellogg Lake and River Forest Lake, for River Forest Lake, it's also pretty close to the Willamette. So it's
cool.
it's adding the complexity is the main thing that the Watersheds Council is focusing on right now.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we're just about to switch into that part of talking about what are the things that we can all do collectively and individually. So, I like that you're action-oriented thinking. So just to kind of sum up this little piece, our channelized streams might be better for you, but worse for your neighbors, right? And if your upstream neighbors are channelizing their streams, that can still be bad for you. Having sinuosity and complexity and wood and things in the creek is just much better for habitat and habitat diversity. So We know a bit more now. So what do? We design with nature better. I think that there's been a shift in thinking of, maybe back in the 30s when they were channelizing the lower 14 miles of Johnson Creek, there might have been this attitude like, we need to control the creek. We need to manage this thing. We need to make it do what we want it to do and not let it do what we don't want it to do. I think that there's something kind of liberating in realizing that we are not in charge of the creek. If we don't give our creeks a place to go, it will pick one. Like, water finds a way. Water will still be there one way or the other. And now that we know more about the factors that affect watershed health, we have kind of a better understanding and are more informed in our watershed management. Yeah. So like rather than trying to tame our water bodies, best practices today are restoring natural processes. Okay. So now again, those three sections of what are the things that influence watershed health. We'll move from left to right as far as categories go. So first we'll talk about individual actions. These are things that you might be able to do on your property, they might feel small, but could still have a big impact. In the photo, I've put, one individual, but all spread across the watersheds, right? Again, we have 165,000 people that live in the North Clackamas watersheds. I'm back. Sorry about that. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. That thing that I talked about where my computer tries to go to sleep, that's what happened. I'm sorry. Okay. Where was I? I was just saying, with so many people in the watershed, those small actions that we do really are cumulative and add up. Okay. So some of the individual things that folks can do, one is just as far as talking about pollution, there's what's called point sources and non-point sources. So a point source of pollution is, for instance, like a factory or an agricultural enterprise, like where there is a defined point in which water is added to the creek and can be providing pollution. Or, before the big pipe existed in the Willamette River, we knew when our sewer overflows were flowing directly into the Willamette River. That was a defined point source pollution. Thinking back to the earlier photos of watersheds and just thinking about how everywhere, no matter where you are, is a watershed, what you do affects what happens downstream. Those are those diffuse types of factors that can contribute to what's called non-point source pollution. So any guess on what % of pollution comes from non-point sources as opposed to point sources? You don't have to shout one out because I'm gonna reveal, but it's over half.
I was gonna say huge.
Yeah, exactly. So we know, to be fair as well, I would say that the point source solution is possibly more likely to be more like acute pollutants, or more impactful, like more just stronger pollutants, like when we think about like toxic chemicals and things like that, right? But yeah, by and large, like 60% or more of pollution comes from these diffuse sources, like motor oil and fertilizers and pet waste and detergents and all of these different things that a drop of rain might pick up and carry as it falls from the sky and moves into the creek. So yeah, individual actions are just ways to kind of be a, neighborly watershed resident. So these are things that you can do if you have a yard, if you have a car, if you have a dog, if you have a rental property. And one thing is, we also all have a voice, and that is absolutely part of this picture. So as far as vehicles go, preventing leaks and spills and cleaning those up immediately and kind of disposing of fluids safely are some of the that's just a really, really great way to avoid some potentially pretty toxic pollutants. So like, for instance, Neil, our executive director, his neighbor works on motorcycles a lot. but always has cardboard laid down to absorb oil. So it's just some of those simple things that we can think about. When it comes to washing our cars, I remember when I was told, like, instead of washing your car in your driveway, like wash it on your lawn because it'll absorb more water. And I thought that was really, really cool, but it still kind of functions like this. Lawns will provide some absorption, but we're still really seeing that those soaps and stuff can get washed directly downstream. So the most watershed informed approach to cleaning your car that I would suggest is to go to a commercial car wash, because there's a lot more going on that we can't see. But we just never really want to let wash water enter our storm drains if we can. And at a commercial car wash, they have reclamation tanks and they filter and reuse water. So it's more efficient from water. And then they also have, there's reclamation of certain pollutants and stuff like that as well. It also just uses less water. Washing our cars at home can take 40 to 100 gallons, but because commercial car washes are more efficient, it's only about 20 to 30. Picking up after our pets is something that definitely does matter. We say what comes out goes downstream. So when you have a lot of pet waste, for instance, there's bacteria and parasites to worry about as well, but then also from a nutrient perspective, we can have algal blooms. And the Watersheds Council what happens with an algae bloom is all of the algae eats up all of the oxygen, and so you have kind of a dead zone in the water, or you can have some toxins in there that are bad for instance, our pets as well. The Watershed Council sometimes fields calls about, hey, the creek is like really bright green all of a sudden this morning. And so going and tracking those sources is one of the ways that nonprofits and local government are kind of poised to respond to watershed health. Sometimes these things are point source and sometimes these are non-point source. Algae is one of the harder ones to track down.
So if we saw something alarming like that, turning green, which has never happened in the little creek in my backyard, who would I call though? Who would be the person to call? Oak Grove Water Services or you all?
Yeah, so Oak Lodge would also help you filter it through. There's also on Clackamas County, a way to like report spills or leaks or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
You can also call us and we can help you figure it out.
Would you comment on the incidence of septic systems versus houses that are tied into the sanitary sewer and how that might impact all of these concerns about what individuals do?
Yeah, I wish that I were more informed on the impacts of septic. I know that generally the preference is to be hooked up to the existing systems because those are going to be better managed, and that water will be treated, whereas the septic systems, you hear about leaking septic systems, and that's certainly not a positive thing for watershed health.
Is there any information available on the total number of septic systems in the watershed versus sanitary sewer hookups?
That's a really great question. I'm gonna look into that. Yeah, when I don't know the answer, I don't want to bluff, and I don't know the answer, so I'll see if I can find it.
Okay. Presumably most all the septic systems are working, but as we get more and more urbanization and more crowding, it's a question. Okay.
Yeah,
thank you.
absolutely. Yeah, and so like one example of I want to say like maybe 2 years ago now, there was a spill. There was an oil leak into Kellogg Creek, and it happened along McLaughlin. And what happened was there was a fire at like an auto center, and so some oil drums burst, and so we had an oil slick in the creek, and that was in a way a better kind of issue because we were able to isolate the source and address stuff from the source. Having a discrete place to respond to is easier than these more diffuse things, like for instance, septic tanks in various states of disrepair. Yeah, it's a good question to think about, Steve. Thank you. This is a sign that folks will see around neighborhoods that just say basically just don't dump anything down this storm drain. The less that goes in, the better. Something that folks can do on their own properties is to put in a residential rain garden. Generally, this looks like disconnecting your downspout. So instead of having your downspout from your gutter going all the way down along the driveway and right up to the storm drain, you can disconnect it and feed it into sort of a basin that you create. So you can dig sort of a bowl shape and put in the kind of layers that you see on the screen here, but you put in plants that are ideally native plants that can filter and absorb that rain, and that this helps to mitigate that imbalance of impervious versus pervious surfaces. So rain gardens just provide more absorption and filtration.
So I'm part of the Friends of Backyard Habitat group because I've applied for backyard habitat status.
Awesome.
And we talk a lot about rain gardens.
Yeah.
Which I think looks like a wonderful and fabulous idea, but it is something that is so beyond my own personal capacity to do. Are there groups or people that will come and put in a rain garden for you? Is that a gardening service? Who would you talk to if you wanted to do that?
Great questions. Okay, so I would refer you to, you might have dug into this already, but the East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District have workshops specifically on building a rain garden. And I would imagine that they and or the backyard habitats can refer you to qualified entities that could do that project for you.
Okay, that's what I'd have to be interested in, because I know there's no way I'm going to go out there and dig a giant hole and even begin to figure out how to fill it correctly and how to deal with it. It just, I look at those pictures and I think that's overwhelming. So thank you. I might be able to look into questioning people that could find the folks who would be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say too, like it's all kind of on a spectrum. Like I've seen folks that sometimes will just work on like the 12 inches or 16 inches of soil adjacent to their driveway, and they'll just remove the lawn and put in native plants there instead. So people will, there's yeah, a rain garden doesn't have to be necessarily a specific size, especially if you're part of the backyard habitat program. Then you probably know that just even replacing a small bit of grass for with native plants is
oh, okay, so that's part of that is also helping the underground aquifer.
Yeah, providing just chances for water to absorb into the ground more is a net benefit, instead of having it slough off, because grass does provide absorption, but even so, like grass and ivy actually both have kind of, I mean, it's a shallow enough root system that there's also a filtration thing where native plants have more diverse root structures and are better able to hold together the soil and reduce erosion and capture pollutants than kind of monocultures of anything, whether it's grass or ivy or whatnot.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. This is going to be a bit of an interactive bit, or it doesn't have to be. For the sake of time, I guess I'll breeze through it a bit quicker. But this is my friend and colleague Noah. Kira, you might recognize. I think you're recognizing him. So the reason why he's here will make sense in a couple of slides, because this is a cropped version of a fuller photo. So I've put Noah in this presentation because he's observing the erosion that's happening here. And you might be asking, what should we do in the cases of erosion? Steve, something that you called out earlier was grass going right all the way to the edges. that's something we absolutely see here, is this kind of lack of vegetation or diverse vegetation. Low flow, but mostly erosion is kind of the concern here. So when people are confronted with erosion concerns, there tend to be two sorts of courses of action that people consider. And one of those is to armor their banks, and the other is a vegetation related route. So we're going to explore the watershed impacts of each of those two options. So when we armor the banks, this is sort of like a smaller version of Johnson Creek's lower 14 miles of channelized WPA wall. When we armor the banks, we do not provide absorption. And so what that's going to do is that's going to do things like increase the water speed, which increases then the strength, the force of the flow. And that in turn is going to exacerbate erosion downstream, right? A potential solution are some plants. So these are willow stakes. I say they're a little like magic. You can just cut off a branch and stick it in the ground and it'll grow into a full new willow tree. So the course of action of riparian vegetation can look like a couple of different phases, but right here what we have is we have coir mats or coir fabric, which is made of coconut fibers, and it's a sort of loose weave of a net. And so you can lay down these mats and then poke the live stakes through the holes in that netting. So the netting will provide a bit of surface level erosion control, but you can plant through it and allow those willow or dogwood or 9-bark, those other stakes to grow. And so as the mat decomposes over time, you'll have the establishment of some native plants alongside streams that can help to provide that shade and habitat and soil control. So this course of action is going to, of course, provide habitat in the form of these plants. So it's also providing shade on top of the creek, which is important for temperature and for fish. Long-term, wood in the stream, habitat benefits generally also include things like that filtration and absorption that we talked about, and reducing the stream energy. And again, those root systems, as they get established, will hold banks together. This is that full photo of Noah that I had cropped at the beginning. So this was after we spent the day harvesting a bunch of willow stakes. And so he was saying, this is the way to go with willow stakes. Okay, a couple of other things that we can do as individuals. I'm realizing I'm a little further behind than I would like to be, so I might speed up a bit. My goal is to move us to Q&As at 7:30 so that we have time to either hop on, stay on, discuss. Other things to do are to reduce or eliminate lawn chemicals entirely, install trees and native plants. Rather than hosing down your driveways, just sweep them. There's no need to use that extra water and move things downstream faster. In wintertime, a lot of de-icers can have harmful chemicals in them, so using things like sand and gravel for traction can be better. This was that page about reporting a spill or a leak on Clackamas County. It looks like this was actually underneath Water Environment Services. So Linda, I'm going to revise my answer earlier when I said Clackamas County. I was thinking Clackamas County because I'm so used to this little thumbnail, and Wes Water Environment Services is part of Clackamas County. Oak Lodge Water Services is Wes's compatriot in a different geographical area, so it would be Oak Lodge. And yeah, on to the next section. I wanted to see if there's anything to add there. Nope. Okay. So these are some of the things that where problems are maybe bigger than just one person. So these are some of the things that the Watershed Council does organizationally, working with others, including you. So kind of throughout the creeks. All right. So what are the things that we can do together? This is just a gratuitous photo by Steve Berliner because his photos are fantastic. But North Clackamas Watersheds Council is a nonprofit, so we're a non-regulatory authority, meaning we don't enforce things, and so that can help pave the way for building relationships with landowners, of course. We also don't have we we don't have any property ownership. So like there's land trusts which acquire land for the sake of conservation and habitat protection. That's not something that the Watershed Council does. We support people and entities throughout the watersheds implementing on the ground restoration. We're pursuing Kellogg Dam and other fish habitat related projects. We do community engagement through workshops such as this. And we also are tapped into watershed science and planning and policy. I'm writing a note to myself so that I don't forget to share it at the end. Yeah, so if we have permission to add you to our newsletters, if you're not there already, we'll periodically send things like, hey, tap into, submit a comment in support of XYZ positive change. Our Streamside Stewards program worked with private landowners to remove invasive plants and plant native plants and introduce complexity into the watershed. So these photos are about 3 years apart. What we experienced over the last decade-ish is that our Streamside Stewards program grew larger than what we were able to maintain. So we've had to go through a prioritization process and look at the most ecologically significant properties, and those are the ones where we're focusing our resources through Streamside Stewards. But we also have in-person workshops that we'll be implementing regularly, which provide anybody and everybody a chance to come in and learn more about the watersheds and what to do kind of on the ground at that time of year. We also have volunteer events. So if you don't have Streamside Sewer property, even if you do, volunteering is a really fun way to get involved. Actually, this Saturday is one of my favorite events across every year, which is the Christmas tree toss. So earlier this month, we collected basically recycled Christmas trees. And we will be working at Elk Rock Island in Spring Park. We'll be carrying the trees down towards the channel and tying them down. There's a little place off of Elk Rock Island where there's off-channel habitat, and so we tie these trees in and they'll provide habitat for fish throughout the year. And we also have planting and other kinds of events year-round. A big work area that we've already talked about here is to remove Kellogg Dam. It was built back when Abraham Lincoln was a congressman. And as I said, it was built to run a flour mill. It's a barrier to fish passage and creates this warm lake behind it. It's a really complicated project. There's a state highway bridge right over. So we have the Department of Transportation and the city of Milwaukee and all of these. And so the vision is for basically Kellogg Creek to become a free-flowing stream again. The dam itself hasn't served that purpose in over 100 years. And as I mentioned, this fish ladder doesn't really work for fish either. Well-intentioned, but ineffective. The only times when we've seen fish accessing habitat upstream of Kellogg Dam is during those couple of days a year where the water is high enough for them to jump up the ladder to access the system. But otherwise, mostly we see otters using it as a slip and slide. Less so for fish. And this project is underway. There's a page on our website that has the kind of most up-to-date information, but the Watershed Council is one of the kind of key partners in this effort and received a really substantial grant from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to work on moving this project forward. So it's happening. The Watershed Council also has an AmeriCorps member named Peyton, who is one of her primary project areas is raising community engagement and awareness about the dam project or the impoundment dam removal. We were trying to avoid saying Kellogg Lake because lake implies a natural body of water and this isn't. So Peyton can do things like provide tours for groups of the project site and things like that. But yeah, this was Senator Jeff Merkley and former Milwaukee Mayor Mark Gamba meeting on site. And other things that we have going on, a couple of years ago, the Watershed Council commissioned a rapid bioassessment, which later informed our watersheds action plan. So the rapid bioassessment identified 39 high priority projects. And one of those includes Ware River Forest and Boardman Creeks, the Willamette River. And so, yeah, there's habitat improvement projects on deck to improve fish habitat at those confluences. And this kind of brings us, also just one of the gaps that the Watershed Council is helping to fill, and I'll talk about this in a moment too, is data. There's been a lack of data essentially about which tributaries are, provide the coldest water, things like that. And so the Watershed Council, deployed temperature loggers to track temperature data throughout, which helped us, which is helping us to know where to focus our efforts, right? So this segues into kind of watershed level planning. So things that we have to do together that no one entity has control over. And these are things where like those groups like West and Oak Lodge Water Services have become really valuable partners. These are things where we're wanting to restore these natural processes and watershed functions. And also talk about how watershed level planning influences the watershed. So this is the now no longer Milwaukee City Hall. I should change this photo since they've moved out of the historic building. But yeah, best practices, are restoring natural processes. So as far as governments and those types of entities go, we have a lot of them. We have 3 cities, different county departments, and 3 special districts throughout the watersheds. And so again, as I said, like salmon don't know what jurisdiction they're in. So our projects, when they work to partnering with governments is really key to these kinds of projects that are going to be, of course, impactful throughout the entire watersheds. So really there's kind of a need to study stuff. We need to know more about, our wetlands and fish passage and again, temperature and things like that. So we're working on getting data. There's ways that we can undo things. So kind of fixing or retrofitting that great infrastructure that was built before we had knowledge of how to, support fish. And also in the category of undo is also new things as far as rules and regulations that incentivize those kinds of projects. And then when it comes to doing things, just making sure that new development is watershed friendly. So there's things like in the last couple of years, West has been updating their stormwater code. The city of Milwaukee has been updating their zoning map. So there's decisions that are being made about like how far a setback from the creek is. Is it, 20 feet? Is it 50 feet? Those types of considerations that lead to development are the things that the Watersheds Council is tapped into. And full disclosure, Neil, our executive director, is the most tapped in to those things. So I would defer to him for any specifics, but these just kind of illustrate the examples of ways that watershed level planning is something that is happening at a big scale, but that involves all of us as individuals, because Neil might show up to, provide testimony at a city council meeting regardless. But if we have 1 or 2 or 10 or 12 community members come in and stress that they also value creek habitat, that's the kind of stuff that can be pretty impactful.
Could we find out about those meetings that would be key to show up at, or the times that it would be key to write to somebody? Because I love to do that sort of armchair activism. Can we find out about that through your newsletter?
Yes, that's
okay.
nice.
Good, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Yeah, so government level planning is just kind of how can we protect floodplains amidst development, and also restore areas where development has already happened. Okay. So as far as watershed level planning goes, the Clackamas Town Center is probably the least watershed friendly thing in our watersheds because there's so much impervious surface there. And this just kind of was to segue into what I've already mentioned, which is part of how do we undo bad development, that was built before we knew better. It requires upping our game with science and having more data and information. And also a lot of these projects are pretty scientifically rigorous and construction oriented, and engineering. There's environmental engineering and a lot of intention behind these. So these kinds of floodplain restoration projects, for instance, aren't technically something that like only the government can do, but we're talking about projects that can be big enough that the government will either need to do it or help fund it. Meaning like these things can be accomplished by government and or nonprofits, but the government is almost always a stakeholder or support / key participant / key landowner. And this is a slide, especially when I have when I'm like talking to students, I always emphasize that environmental engineering is a whole career field. But I'll digress from that for now, since we're just about at time and I only have a few slides left. Green infrastructure. So this is a thing that needs to be done together. These things happen more quickly and better when they're incentivized or requirement by the government to some degree. So this is just showing our bioswales, like in our streets and parking lots. They're connected to our underground infrastructure through perforated pipes. Detention ponds might not look like much, but there's often underground infrastructure. And these are designed to provide a chance to infiltrate, for water to infiltrate, to control flooding and minimize erosion. And these things will have water quality benefits as well. This is an example of that kind of undoing or retrofitting gray infrastructure. So this is in Southwest Portland, near Multnomah Arts Center, but there was this chunk of pavement that wasn't providing any benefit, and now it is. Okay, but back to the tale of two buildings from the beginning. At the beginning, we were showing just that one building with like a green roof and a bioswale and a rain barrel and things like that. We can also think of this at a development scale. We know that housing is a growing need. And so there's something called low impact development, where there might be things in low impact development. These two housing developments actually have the same number of lots. But what we have on the right hand side in the low impact development setup, we have a more functional creek. There's more green space that's preserved here. Existing trees can be more actively preserved, minimizing impervious surface runoff is something that can be a consideration for low impact development. Just generally these different best management practices that can be incorporated into planning are kind of key to implement. And it's just things like, like the streets are a bit narrower, which is coincidentally also tends to be safer for pedestrians and better for kids. And having green space and access to green spaces is really closely tied with, but there's a lot of really strong correlations to benefits for human health. We're going to dig into those kinds of things actually on Wednesday night. But basically watershed level planning is going to affect the codes that incorporate these type of development standards. So this tale of two buildings or tale of two cities, right? We can proceed with the status quo, which is to have housing developments being installed in the upper watersheds with kind of as is minimal stormwater treatment standards. That's going to lead to more impervious surfaces. That's going to lead to flooding downstream. And then we're going to have neighbors making that decision between armoring their banks or putting in plants. And if more people are going to be, armoring their banks, that is going to just yield more flooding downstream. So it's kind of this vicious cycle that can get perpetuated, right? Alternatively, if we are active in processes and we see that low impact development is getting, is prioritized, and we have codes that necessitate or that have stronger enforcement on things like impervious surface runoff, we're going to have more of a chance for water to absorb and or to get filtered, and we'll have less flooding downstream, so less neighbors worried about making a decision to armor their banks. Hopefully more folks open to things like the backyard habitat program and planting, and ultimately healthier watershed and habitat. So this was a coho up in Mount Scott Creek near Mount Talbert in 2018. So again, there's lots and lots of different factors that can influence these things, but of those two scenarios, right, which would we prefer? Probably that second one. So being involved in watershed level planning can be really valuable. And in a way, it sort of brings those three chapters a bit full circle where even what we're here, we're talking about watershed level impacts of things that happen at the government level, but individual participation can be really key to moving these things forward. So for instance, I just moved to Happy Valley less than a year ago, and I'm thinking I might join like the budget committee for the city because I'm not so sure if the city is spending as much money on natural resources as we can and should be. And I lived in Milwaukee for 10 years before that and was on the tree board in Milwaukee. So yeah, getting tapped into these kinds of things can be important. And this again is a Neil Neil input as far as this is something I can do for you. What are some ways we can support your watershed stewardship is what we want to know. So I mentioned our newsletters already. We would love to hear what things are interesting for you, something that you would like to do or implement or learn more about. And then Linda, as you kind of got ahead of the narrative here with us asking you to use your voice and sending out tapping in some way into different processes. So yeah, tomorrow we'll talk about wildlife, and then Wednesday we'll talk about people. And that leads me to asking if there are questions.
Yeah. And is it fair to say that the Watershed Council is the leader in either legislation or decisions within the city about more environmental friendly decisions that they make, or are they just strictly advisory?
Great question. Are you talking about for the city of Milwaukee particularly?
Well, any of the cities. There's really the conflict between the political decisions and how they make rules and regulations, and whether they make more parking lots or they don't make more parking lots in
Yeah.
terms of what's better for the ecology of the system. How does this all interact?
Yeah. It depends on each entity is the funny thing. Like the relationship with Milwaukee versus Gladstone versus Happy Valley, each of those relationships is different. So Milwaukee and North Clackamas Watersheds Council has been pretty actively engaged with the city of Milwaukee in a lot of things. And they have some really excellent staff members that are also working on like climate action plans and these kinds of natural resource considerations. The relationship with Gladstone and Happy Valley are less involved, and Clackamas County, a lot of the watersheds are in unincorporated Clackamas County, right? The whole Oak Grove and Jennings Lodge area. That's a tough one too, because or maybe especially tough one because Clackamas County is so large that there isn't even, last I heard, there isn't even any code related to street trees.
Yeah.
And that makes sense in rural parts of Clackamas County, perhaps, where we have, the Mount Hood National Forest. But here within the urban growth boundary, there's more of a need for those things. So you're asking about like the relationships and whether the Watershed Council is kind of the leader. I don't know that I would call the Watershed Council a leader, but I would say that we are engaged and participatory and seeking and kind of encourage and request that type of participatory decision making.
Do they serve as a watchdog in terms of what's happening within the county or the cities?
I think I wouldn't go so far as to call us a watchdog per se, and some of that is, I guess maybe the way I would characterize it, and this, a bit of this is a guess. I would also be interested in hearing Neil's response to this question. It is more of encouraging them to do the good thing when they're on the right track, really supporting that, refining that, pushing that a little bit to be a little bit even more like cutting edge as far as regulations go. I don't think that it's very often that the council will come out in opposition or protest two things, and part of that is because we get funded by local government quite a lot.
Yes,
Um,
okay.
And so, yeah, it's kind of that constructive criticism, like positive feedback is the attitude that I would say is most frequently employed.
So they are funded by the local communities. I mean, the
Yeah.
watershed council.
We get funding from that's right, because you joined in right after the first slide showed three of our funders, which were Water Environment Services, Clackamas West, and Oak Lodge Water Services, as well as the Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District.
Okay.
And then we also get funding for different projects, such as from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that are a bit more project oriented. Yeah. I like that each of your questions have been kind of where the rubber meets the road as far as decision making, because that's something that I throughout my adulthood, I'm just realizing every time I learn something new, it's more and more important to me being involved in those local processes.
I understand.
Yeah. And Neil Schulman, our executive director, is the one that is the voice from the Watershed Council in those processes a lot, especially. So I'm not a year-round or a full-time like staff member with the council. Most of my job is with Tryon Creek Watershed Council. I'm the coordinator there, and that's in Southwest Portland. I just contract outreach and education work for the Watersheds Council. And Kira is a new staff member and will be taking on these workshops from me in the future. So as the Watershed Council grows in staff, such as with having Kira now, 5 years ago, it was just one staff person, and now there's 3 and an AmeriCorps member. And so as the council grows, I think so too will the council's like capacity. But as it has been, Neil Schulman has been the one who's been on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So any specific questions, he's great to connect to about those things. And I believe that for North Clackamas, that our board meetings are open for the public, so community members can just come and listen in on things. I know that's the case for me at Tryon. But I would say that there's also committees that I think are open to non-board members to participate in, like a land use committee and things like that. So there's, if either of you are really curious about that, I would absolutely encourage and be happy to connect you with Neil.
I'm curious about the temperature data collection.
Yeah.
Are you looking for volunteers for somebody to put a thermometer in their creek?
Oh, we were a couple of years ago when we were getting those in. Kira, do you have more updated information? You look like you were about to add something.
Linda, you're in
Forest.
You're
Forest.
I don't actually I got excited because I've been thinking about it a lot, but I don't think I have a super recent update.
Okay.
But I think there might be some citizen science projects that are ongoing, especially around like the
Kellogg.
Yeah, I know that that's one thing.
Yeah. So Linda, as far as temperature logging goes, Amy Van Riesen is I don't remember her title, but she's the science research person. And so the way that the temperature logging goes is you deploy this thing in the creek, and it takes data every, I don't know, 12 hours or 24 hours or something like that, maybe even hourly. And it stays in the creek for months at a time, and then you go back and you fetch it again.
Nice.
And so I remember I helped close the gap for Amy for getting loggers at a certain few geographic, like near certain confluences in a watershed. I think that those are established, but that's really good to know if you are interested. I'll just be sure to just mention it to Amy over email. As far as river forest goes, I think the results were pretty clear that the river forest lake
is affecting the temperature.
Yeah.
Near the lake. Yeah, near the lake. So one of the things I have been working on with my creek, just personally, is getting rid of the blackberries. I had probably 200 square feet of solid blackberry growth in the back part of my property that I managed to get removed.
Way to go.
My neighbor is the one who kind of brought it to my attention that it was starting to encroach upon his side. And
Mhm.
so we've been working together. And he said that years ago, people from Oak Lodge Water District had come out to help with some of the removal. I've been able to get rid of what's on the ground,
Uh-huh.
like literally what's on the ground level. But what is still a huge challenge is getting rid of what's on the banks. It's a very, the part of the creek that goes through my property is very steep edges, not all that deep, but they're very steep sides. And
Right.
it's encroached blackberries on the sides that are just stubborn as all get out. And so I'm looking for resources to help me with that, because again, I had people come in and dig out what was on the ground level and work in the creek, but I can maintain keeping the ground level bare. I can't go down into the creek to
Yeah,
dig
down slope.
blackberries. So I'm
Yeah.
curious about what kind of resources might be available to help with that.
Yeah. So, those types of projects are something that the Watersheds Council used to fund and implement through our Streamside Stewards program that we, as I mentioned, have had to kind of retool and figure out where to focus because those resources would get spent up so quickly. One of the things that I'm working on is actually with the folks at Backyard Habitat Certification Program. On their website, they have like a pro referral list, and you can search different types of professionals like landscape architects and things like that. I'm working to, and Kira, this is a spoiler alert for you too, to basically get a description sent over to Susie at the Backyard Habitats program that describes this more specialized type of maintenance that landowners are in need of on small properties, meaning sloped is the main thing, sloped and with an emphasis on native plants.
Yes.
And so the hope is that the pros that are part of that pro referral directory, those that have experience or want to gain experience in working on slopes, can basically be flagged for that and be a specific resource. So like
So
I could,
is the buzzword that I need to use.
pardon?
And thoughts about it. I was interested in the whole willow stake,
Yeah.
and if that's something that could work along that super sloped area.
Yeah, the thing with stakes is you can have them the width of a pencil, or you can have them, a full inch or two in diameter, but usually about 3/4 of an inch or something like that. Thanks, Kira. And I would say that they totally could work. Willow, as well as potentially 9-bark, maybe salmonberry, and
9-bark, did you say?
yeah, Pacific 9-bark really likes having its feet wet. And does well enough with staking. Yeah, 9-bark and salmonberry. I feel like I'm blanking on one, but I'm not sure. Yeah, so the staking could absolutely work. And probably it sounds like something maybe not that you would want to do yourself since it's steep. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, so, and this is why I want to close that gap with the Backyard Habitat Certification Program, because we, I wish that I had like, oh, contact, here's a list of like 5 different groups to reach out to, and they'll come and do that work for you. I don't have that list right now, but we're trying to get that, if that makes sense.
That's very cool. Yeah, because I have been in touch with Backyard Habitat.
Yeah.
Because they're dying to get my certification moved ahead. And what's blocking me is basically nothing but the blackberries that are down in the creek.
Downslope.
And so I'm trying to find innovative ways to kind of move that last step forward.
Yeah.
Just from learning about tonight, which was incredibly valuable, thank you so much. That's clearly like the crowning thing of what I really need to do to help that little tiny section that I am a steward of get healthier.
Right. Yeah, I'll send you one or two. There's like one person who has done this kind of work like on the side, but I don't remember. I think he's had some injuries lately, so I'm not sure if he's still able to.
Okay.
I'll send you an email with a couple of leads. I don't want to, I would say, have zero or low expectations, but I will send them to you just in
Absolutely.
case.
No, I totally understand. This is, yeah, this is a fishing expedition. Because I totally understand. Yeah, I'm the one who's gonna have to do the homework. So, but any resources I can get are very helpful. I have already signed up for your newsletter. I'm gonna let you go because I'm the last person hanging on. And I just wanted to say super much thank you. So this is so helpful. I will be back tomorrow night, and I wish I could come Wednesday because the activism part of it is what I'm really interested in too, but I'm not going to be able to make it.
Okay, well, I think I'll plan on continuing to record these for Kira. So if I remember to do that, I'll also have us recording on Wednesday.
Great. Well, I will be very grateful. So you linked you mentioned to do an evaluation of the workshop. We should just email Neil.
Oh, because that was on the screen, the evaluation link. I I need to send an evaluation link.
Oh, do send the evaluation link because I want to give you very high kudos.
Okay, thank you.
It was a wonderful and very educational workshop. So thank you so much.
I'm so glad. Awesome. Thanks, Linda.
And otherwise, though, I will let you go because it's like so past so past the time you need to be here.
It's great. I like these conversations.
But thank you so much. I really appreciate all your help.
Thanks, Linda. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.